Hey there everyone, so I wanted to do a short little lecture here talking about the problem of evil. Now, maybe you've heard about this, maybe you haven't. It's one of the most popular objections to theism, which is the belief in God. And, if you want to know more about theism versus atheism, I've done a lecture on atheism specifically, and then on a number of other different philosophical objections to Christian ethics, to the way atheists are treated in the Bible. But an important objection is the problem of evil. And if you don't know how it goes, there's lots of different varieties, but basically it hinges on looking at the conception of God, specifically in Abrahamic religions. So this would be Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. Looking at that conception of God and contraposing that with reality and seeing how there is a disconnect here, how it could not be possible for this God concept to be an explanation for this reality, precisely because that God's supposed qualities contradict the reality that we see. And it hinges on three attributes. These have been called the tri-omni attributes, and this is omnibenevolence, so all-loving, omniscience, which is all-knowing, and omnipotence, which is all-powerful. And as a result, a lot of philosophers throughout history have looked at these concepts and wondered, why is there evil in the world? And not merely why is there evil in the world, but given the postulate of God, why is there evil with reference to this system? Because when you think about it for a second, it's a little bit of a strange concept. If we have this loving God, he would do everything he can to minimize our suffering and maximize our pleasure or well-being. And as such, there seems to be very much a need to explain why there could be any suffering at all, or at the very least, why there is the magnitude of suffering that we see. And a very interesting place in which we see this argument in philosophy/literature is in Justine by the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade is a very famous libertine French philosopher, and here at the very end of the book, we get the argument in a pretty cogent manner. I quote here from page 224, if you've got this Oxford edition. "If there were a God, I believe there would be less evil in this world. I believe that if evil does exist here, either such disorder is ordered by this God, in which case he is a barbaric entity, or else he is unable to prevent it, and then he is a weak God. In either case, he is an abominable being, a being whose thunderbolts I am bound to defy and whose laws I must despise. Oh, Thérèse, is not atheism better than either of these extremes?" So notice here, the question is, and oftentimes you could take the problem of evil to the extreme and say that no evil at all is justified given this tri-omni vision of God. Again, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. But at the very least, the Marquis de Sade is merely inquiring as to why there is as much evil or suffering as there is. And this is commonly called the problem of evil, and some Christians or Muslims or Jews, I'm fairly familiar with the Christian rhetoric with regards to this. They'll say, oh, you're postulating the very notion of some objective evil in the notion of the problem of evil. No, I am not saying that some objective morality exists by using this, and therefore I'm shooting myself in the foot. No, on the grounds of the Christian or the Muslim or the Judaic paradigm, I'm saying that if evil exists in the manner that it is claimed to, and given the attributes of God, evil requires explaining. And the point here is that either God allows this suffering to happen, in which case it's part of his will, in which case he is not all-loving because he purposely machinated evil to exist and be rampant, or God could not stop this evil from existing, in which case he is impotent. And thus we have the classic God is either impotent or evil. This is what is trying to be derived from this argument. And the most common objection, there are a number of objections, and these are all called theodicies, is that we must have free will, and thus evil is a necessary possibility of the fact that we have free will. Now, of course, the question of whether or not we have free will is certainly a contentious one, but even supposing that we do, what this means is that God did not have the power to create the world in such a way that we could live with free will and not have suffering. Because a very salient objection to this is, do we have free will in heaven? And you're like, okay, in a sense, maybe we do, maybe we don't. Let's say we don't have free will in heaven. Well, this just means that we can be in a state of perfect bliss and no suffering without the need for free will, in which case it makes no sense why we have it here. Let's say we do have free will in heaven, though. That means there is a possible orchestration of the world we live in such that one can have free will and only choose good actions. Maybe this is simply the case that only good actions are presented to one. Because if it was only the case that you could only exercise your free will on good actions in the face of bad actions as well, well, then the will's obviously not free, because you're only allowed to choose good actions even when bad ones are present. And thus it's not really free will, you're just being forced to do good. But it seems that if free will exists in heaven, then one only has the option to do good things. Evil or suffering is not even a possibility. And thus, one can freely choose between a number of events, a number of possibilities, all of which will result in no suffering and pleasure in its place. And thus, there is a possibility to have free will and no suffering. Or there's the possibility to have no suffering and no free will. So either way, this free will objection seems to crumble when we are faced with the notion of a perfect afterlife, whether or not there is suffering there in the first place. So it seems that our only conclusion can be that there is a logical impossibility with this very conception of God. That the tri-omni constitution of God is not a logical possibility. We couldn't even say, oh, maybe it's the case that the Christian or the Muslim or the Judaic God exists. It is a logical impossibility given these attributes of God. So either one can say that this is in fact not what the Abrahamic God is, or we can say that we do in fact know that the Abrahamic God has these qualities, and thus we can say, by matter of fact, by logical possibility and surety, that this God concept is impossible to exist. It is not even a question of whether it could exist in some other possible world. No. Given the world we have, there is no possible room to smuggle in this God as a sort of explanation. And thus, this is the reason that many atheists will say, well, with regard to particular God concepts that one can logically examine and undermine, such as the Abrahamic God concept, they can say, yes, I know for a fact by logical necessity that this God concept cannot exist. Whereas there are plenty of God concepts that I'm not even aware of, or that I haven't examined closely enough to know for sure that is a logical impossibility. And thus, in the broadest possible sense, this atheist can be a hardcore, I can know for certain that such and such concept doesn't exist with regard to particular God concepts, but with regards to the notion of God as such, because of course our knowledge is itself impotent, there's so much we don't know, that one can be an agnostic on the broad sense. And thus, this is what one means usually by agnostic atheist. That maybe you can be sure that some God concepts cannot exist, while on the large scale, you're not really sure about God as a result and on the whole. So I hope this video has been of a little bit of help. I'm sure plenty of people will just stick their foot in the sand and be like, no, you just haven't searched hard enough, even though, I don't know, you don't know me, so I'm just the guy on the internet. So hopefully this can be of some use. Check out my other lectures that I do on tons of other philosophical concepts, critical theory, gender theory, postmodernism, literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month, and I do a private philosophy Zoom once a month. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.